In our final podcast in this set, we're again joined by Karen Fulton from African law firm Bowmans, and we're covering other key relevant employment law topics.
Hi again, Karen. Could we start by asking you to explain the different employee representative bodies in South Africa and the roles they play, so works councils, trade unions, and so on?
So the two, we don't really have works councils, as I mentioned in our previous podcast, although the Labour Relations Act does make provision for what is referred to as a workplace forum, the equivalent of a works council. I've never seen one in my 30 years of practicing. And there are two sort of unique things, bodies in the South African context. The one would be trade unions. And as I mentioned in the previous podcast, pre-democratic South Africa, one of the areas in which people of color could exercise power was in the workplace, which led to an extremely strong trade union movement pre-1994, when the democratic government came in. It's changed a bit now. The unions, that we still have a very highly unionized workforce, but the unions are not as strong as they were. So that's the one aspect. The other aspect is that we have a thing called bargaining council agreements. So in certain industries, you have bargaining councils, which really means that the main employers in the industry and the main trade unions in the industry have got together and they've agreed how they're going to regulate their industry. And then they would conclude a bargaining council agreement, and that agreement usually deals with things like terms and conditions of minimum terms and conditions of employment, sometimes dismissal provisions, and it usually only applies to the parties to the agreement, but sometimes on application to the Minister of Labour, it can be extended to non-parties. So I think that's an unusual aspect, I think, compared to employment law in the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. We certainly don't have certainly those kind of sector level bargaining agreements are not particularly common in the UK.
No, and really interesting that it can be extended sort of by the Secretary of State themselves rather than sort of with agreements between the parties. Really interesting.
Yeah.
Then moving on to the pandemic, we can't get away from it at the moment. The pandemic's obviously seen a huge increase in remote working, at least in the UK and in most other countries. And this has really accelerated a trend which was starting to move before the pandemic. So many employers are looking at reducing their office space, and maybe some of them certainly have been considering getting rid of office space altogether. Is this a trend that you are seeing in South Africa, and does that work in practice, or is there a requirement for employers to have office space for staff to go into?
I mean, interestingly, we took up the Johannesburg office of Bowmans took up, I think it was 9 floors, and we in our building, and we gave 2 away in the pandemic. So even Bowmans is moving towards a different model of working. Our offices have been reconfigured, and there's many more hotspots now, or I'm not sure what, desks that you can go and sit at. You just have to book the desk, although partners still have their own offices. So there's very much a trend towards, I think the same as the rest of the world, a hybrid model where employees can work from home but are also in the office. What I find quite amusing is pre-pandemic, we were under significant pressure from millennials to let them work remotely. And, you know, if they wanted to be in the Isle of Man or, I don't know, on a beach in Barbados, that they could do that and still work. Whereas post-pandemic, all the millennials want to come back to the office, and all the baby boomers want to work remotely. So it's definitely turned around.
Yeah, I'm tempted to say we'll probably see something fairly similar. I think there's definitely large swathes of, I suppose the younger population that, you know, really see the benefit of being in the office and kind of interacting with other people. And certainly the hybrid model is something that we see a lot and with our clients, and yeah, certainly ourselves, it works well. It's this might be, I suppose, one of the upsides of the pandemic, that we have this more flexibility in the way that we work.
One of the things we looked at, actually, we had a webinar on it yesterday, is that there are tax consequences. There's a lot of tax implications and consequences in relation to changes, for example, with reps, sales representatives, and remote working. So that's something that employers in South Africa need to just be aware of, that tax will change if you've got employees that are not roaming around the country anymore, or you know, no longer coming to the office.
Yeah, and we have similar issues in the UK, with people then asking whether they can expense their travel to the office or so on, and there are very rigid rules about when you can actually do that, and normally you can't. So yeah, very similar. And the other big tax thing that we've seen across Europe is people that want to go and work in a different European jurisdiction, and every country has its own rule.
Yeah.
And, you know, not only employment law, but particularly tax rules to think about. And have you seen that in Africa?
Yes, same. Yeah. It's the same, yeah.
Are there any other issues that you'd like to flag to businesses employing people in South Africa, Karen? Is there anything you think we haven't?
I think the only other thing is, and probably it's the same as the rest of the world, is this question around whether you can have mandatory vaccination policies. It's extremely complex in South Africa because there's constitutional rights around bodily integrity, for example, freedom of religion. But the bottom line answer is you can have a mandatory policy, but you need to make proper accommodation for genuine cases. There might also be health issues as to why a person is not having a vaccination. How you go about implementing the policy, what can be in the policy, what you do with outliers, that's all something to be very sensitively and dealt with and carefully thought through. And we anticipate that ultimately the Constitutional Court will make a hand on a decision on this, make a call on it. I can't see, though, that when push comes to shove, that an employer is not entitled to protect its employees in the same way that it, many years ago, people used to smoke in offices, and employers had smoking policies to make sure that it protected its employees from the harm from smoking. And I don't see that having a mandatory vaccination policy is any different to that type of issue.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're absolutely right. The vaccine mandate issue has been a big one across all the jurisdictions, and we've certainly worked with a few clients to try and work out what they can do policy-wide globally. And what definitely becomes apparent is that having the same policy in every jurisdiction is almost impossible. But it's an interesting one. It'll be interesting to see how it kind of starts to change, possibly, as in societies open up. Like in the UK here, we are much more. A lot of things are everything's fairly open at the moment, and so the need, I want to say, for vaccination mandates in offices is almost not as great anymore. But obviously every country's at different stages of its progress in all of this, aren't they?
I mean, I was really excited in South Africa. The numbers have dropped significantly. We through our fourth wave, and there's a lot of, both in the local press and the global press, there's a lot of talk about COVID becoming endemic as opposed to being a pandemic. Then I read in the newspaper today that Hong Kong is having a huge surge, and there's a big shortage of hospital beds and people are dying. And then I get, it makes me pessimistic again. But hopefully most of the world is coming through the other end.
Yeah, hopefully it's not a new variant that we have to deal with.
Hopefully.
Perfect. Well, I think that wraps up our series, Karen. So thank you so much. It's been incredibly interesting, and we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. And if anyone has any queries on the topics we've discussed, please do get in touch with us or with Karen. And please do look out for our next set of podcasts in this series. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks so much.